Welcome back to Verse versus Verse. Today we will be reading from the book of Susanna, or rather, it's usually viewed as a part of the book of Daniel to those who view it as scripture. It's not part of the Protestant canon, which is why this is part of our Protestants React series. Last time we did Prayer of Azariah. But we're hoping that by reading some of these extant books, books outside of our view of the Bible, that we can learn a thing or two from them and that we can have a good time being edified by some of the writings of our spiritual ancestors, even if they weren't necessarily inspired, in our view. In any case, hoping to learn a lot here. I believe for all three of us, this will be our first time reading through Susanna, so do not expect the highest level professional commentary, but do expect a real reaction from people who know a thing or two about the rest of Scripture, and gonna have some fun time reading through this. So, Jace, if you could.
All right, I'm going to start out with an introduction that was written on the Jewish Women's Archive, which combines a lot of different Second Temple writings, of which this story is one. So, in brief, Susanna's story comes from Greek manuscripts of the Book of Daniel, and it's included in the Christian but not the Jewish canon. Now, asterisk here, I'm adding this in. Included in some of the Christian canon, but it is not included in the Jewish Tanakh. It was written during the Hellenistic period after Alexander the Great's conquests, and this story depicts a woman named Susanna, a wealthy Babylonian Jewish woman. Two judges have conspired to trap her, in threatening to accuse her of adultery if she refuses to have sex with them, but due to her strong faith, she refuses their advances and they take her to the court and accuse her. She calls out to God, and God replies to her plea, sending a man named Daniel, who we're all familiar with, to reveal the judges as false witnesses and save Susanna from her death sentence. In brief, the self-contained story of Susanna appears in Greek but not Hebrew manuscripts of the Book of Daniel. Most modern editions of the Christian Bible would include it amongst the apocryphal or deuterocanonical, that's a new word for me, books as Daniel chapter 13. Although readers will respond to and remember most vividly Susanna and her predicament, the story's conclusion emphasizes Daniel's emergence as a young figure of wisdom. On the account of his youth here, some ancient Greek versions actually place the book of Susanna before Daniel chapter 1. So that's just kind of the background of where this is found in the canon or in the apocryphal works, where it's supposed to be located on the timeline and the players that are going to be involved here.
Excellent.
So let's jump into the text. Starting in verse 1. A man named Joachim once lived in Babylon. His wife, Susanna, Hilkiah's daughter, was very beautiful and honored the Lord. Her parents were good people, and they taught their daughter according to the law from Moses. Joachim was very rich, and he had a large private garden next to his home. The Jews came to him because he was the most honored among them. 2 elders among the people had been appointed as judges that year. It was about them that the Lord had spoken. Lawless disorder has come out of Babylon, from judges who were supposed to guide the people. These men spent a lot of time at Joachim's house, and all the people with lawsuits came to them. When the people went away in the middle of the day, Susanna would walk around her husband's private garden, and every day the 2 elders would see her coming in and walking around, and they desired her sexually. They ceased thinking clearly, neither looking to heaven nor caring about justice. Both of them thought about her and nothing else, but they didn't tell each other their craving, because they were ashamed to admit how they desired her and wanted to be with her. But they were on the lookout every day, eager to get a glimpse of her. All right, I want to pause here real quick. Couple of themes that I'm already noticing, and I don't know if you guys are also noticing the same thing. There's 2 things. One, this just timeline-wise is definitely appearing well after David and Bathsheba. I'm getting some pretty similar vibes here, right? Like they're seeing her, they're desiring her, they're conspiring, they're trying to get a glimpse of her. I feel like there's a comparison to be made there. I don't know if I assume it's an intentional parallel. What do you think?
It could be an intentional parallel. It also could just be contemporary to the writings of the time that this is being written. I will say, so what is the... I don't know. I will say this one feels just a bit more like forced into the Book of Daniel, if that makes sense, than the other reading in the Prayer of Azariah. Does it make sense?
I feel like no question, this is a Second Temple writing. This is not part of the original Book of Daniel. I feel like this right here is, from what I understand about how these writings work, this was essentially Rabbi's commentary on one of the ways that Daniel showed himself to be a wise person. I think is kind of like
Right.
it's supposed to set him up as a figure like symbolic of being a very wise individual.
While I understand that, I feel like even with the language, the languages that are used in Daniel, and Daniel's linguistics are very unique in
Yeah.
Scripture.
I mean,
Even
considering the
then,
language,
yes,
the actual language.
even with that, it does appear though that like the wording that's used, the way that everything is phrased, the way that everything is presented, the structure of everything feels very, very different than some of the other stories. And so, just off the cuff, just my initial response to this, my initial feeling of this is, based on the fact that this feels very much is very different than the rest of the book, obviously. And this one feels a lot more, I guess, closer to a extra biblical text. Like some of them, you could definitely see it being introduced and being in line with some of the structure of the book. And this one just feels very much like there was a story. It's related to this. And so it's placed with this, but feels very disjointed from the rest of, really not even just the rest of the story, but it feels very disjointed linguistically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like Prayer of Azariah definitely stuck with a lot of the themes of the book of Daniel itself, whereas this seems to be introducing different themes and just using Daniel's story as a setting for it. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's basically that even with the Prayer of Azariah, there seemed to be a consistency in the theming, in the messages, and even in the character, the characters themselves. But even the subject matter, the way things are phrased, is very much. I guess I wouldn't say it's more contemporary, but I don't know how else to phrase it. Even like the language itself, the way that everything is structured is less. It seems less like the ancient time, more like you said, fits even in the later Second Temple period. I would say is where it seems to fall.
Yeah, Brad, anything you've noticed?
I would just echo everything you've both been saying. One thing that I think is peculiar that we're seeing already is it says it was about them that the Lord had spoken. Lawless disorder has come out of Babylon from elders, from judges who were supposed to guide the people. I googled that really quick, and I know that googling something in 10 seconds is not the most diligent type of research in the world, but we are doing live reactions, that's why. And I couldn't find what it's referencing, which makes me think that it's quoting another piece of extant literature
Almost certainly
that we've lost,
almost
which is just interesting.
I don't even know if it is lost or if maybe it's just a paraphrase, so therefore it's not going to show
That's
up as
possible.
easily on a Google search.
Given that this is in the
That's
Catholic
fair. I
canon,
figure somebody
I
has a
would've thought.
commentary on it. That
Exactly, and I wrote what is being quoted and then the quote, and no commentary came
If
out.
I had to guess, because I obviously don't know, if I had to guess, this is because we're in the book of Daniel too. It could very well be that what was written in a different context, in a different language, translated, then translated. And so we're
Right.
getting the Google translated version of whatever this is. Kind of like when you're reading and it, like in the New Testament, and it quotes something, but it quotes it a little bit differently than whatever our Old Testament translation would have of it, because they're actually quoting. Well, they're not quoting the King James version of the Old Testament. They're quoting the Hebrew and a bit of Aramaic from the Old Testament, but they're quoting it in Greek, and so they're translating it from the old language to that language, and we're just translating it from the old language into our language. But when we get to the New Testament, they're translating it from the old language to their language, and then we're translating that into our language. So, like, when you start getting into, like, the further down you go, it becomes, the translations become a little more, like, a little harder to connect to maybe something else. Because if we started piecing it back together in the original language, we might be able to easily piece together what it's referring to. But it's probably not whatever the language is that this is taken from is probably not the original language that was written in.
Right. And the other thing that I'm really interested to figure out as we go along here is where this takes place chronologically in the life of Daniel, because I had assumed coming in that it would be before the story, before what we think of as Daniel 1. But I'm not so sure now, because this appears to be taking place in Babylon, and Daniel 1 introduces Daniel's early days in Babylon. And so, I don't know. We will see. I'm just very interested to see where this falls in the whole timeline.
Okay, so the other thing that I noticed, and I think that this is a much more direct connection, is in verse 8. Every day the two elders would see her coming in and walking out around, and they desired her sexually. All right, this is a very basic biblical theme. So you got two people, they see something, and they desire it.
Yep.
That's just straight up, like, Eve and the tree right there. So I feel like that's just a direct tie back to a classic, like, biblical theme. No question there. So it's just interesting to see now these guys are seeing and desiring. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add, it's taking place in a literal garden. The previous line is in her husband's private garden.
I didn't even consider that. Yeah. So this is definitely a testing, like this is one of the testing motifs that you'll see all throughout Genesis and throughout the rest of the Bible. David's testing story with Bathsheba, which he obviously failed. They're testing a story which they're about to fail, I'm sure.
They saw and they took, they saw and they took, they saw and they took.
Yeah, it's nothing new. All right, moving on to verse 13. One said to another, "It's time for lunch, let's go home." They split up and left, but doubling back, they met again at the same place. They started asking each other for an explanation, and so each confessed his desire. Then they plotted together for a time when they would be able to find her alone. When they were watching closely for the right moment, Susanna came by just as she had the day before and the day before that, alone with her two female servants. She wanted to bathe in the privacy of the garden since it was hot. No one was there except the two elders who were hidden and spying on her. She said to her female servants, "Please bring me some olive oil and lotion and lock the gates so I can bathe." They did just what she said. They locked the gates to the garden and went through the side doors into the house to fetch the things she had wanted. They didn't see the elders since they were hiding. All right, pausing again. Even more David and Bathsheba's story, right? Like, she wants to bathe and they're there spying on her. Come on.
Well, the difference here is that David was up on the roof. Now, he shouldn't have been there, but at the same time, he was up on the roof where he was perfectly allowed to walk. He shouldn't have been home, but he was up, and he was just looking about, surveying things as a king does, and he sees something. This is two creepy old men break into their buddy's house to watch this girl bathe. Creepy. It's just creepy.
Yeah, it's
I do think.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I do think that the David motif is being called upon, though. Even though they are being creepier, worse versions of David, I do still think the creeping on a girl that they desire when she's bathing thing is.
There's no way that the original
reference.
Audience wouldn't hear that. Yeah,
that's absolutely fair. There's so much weird about First of all, they're like, "Hey, I want that girl. You want that girl. Hey, now that I know that, let's team up." Because that's the natural response when it's like, hey, the natural response for two old men having this conversation is we got to get, that's not right. We should hold each other accountable and not do that. But their go-to reaction is, oh, well, now that I know that, we can team up and go and creep on this girl. This does not seem...
I just like to throw in...
I don't like at all where this is going, by the way.
I just like to throw in that this incorporating a very bizarre sexual narrative raises its likelihood of inspiration in my mind, not decreases, given the rest of the Old Testament. So, I mean, Judah and Tamar come to mind, and a million others. So, it's in good company in being a bit off-putting in its introduction.
I also have a thought on this thinking back on this lawless disorder quote that you're saying you couldn't find. I have a thought of what it makes me think of in Scripture. Should I save that for the end and just come back to it? Because I'm curious of. Okay,
I can't wait.
Eight verses from Psalms 82. God takes his position in his assembly. He judges in the midst of the gods. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute, rescue the weak and needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you will die like men and fall like one of the princes. Arise, God, judge the earth, for you possess all the nations. So, I know that one of the Second Temple writings considered Melchizedek to be one of the council of the gods, or one of the heavenly council. So I know that there was at least a theme that was present. I don't know how pervasive it was, of biblical characters being part of this council of the heavens. So I'm almost wondering if from judges who were supposed to guide the people is kind of referencing this psalm of how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Because that's what it makes me think of, at least.
If I'm being honest, I see more of a parallel just back to the book of Judges and the general theme of having judges over the people of Israel when they're in sort of a captive state.
I get that. I can see that. The thing about it too, though, is it's like, what is this referencing? Well, you could try to point to one thing, but
yeah, it's referencing themes and motifs for sure.
It's so universally seen throughout the Old Testament. It's really hard to just go back and be like, we're talking about, because you say, okay, it could be judged, but it could be Ezekiel. I mean, you could go back and point exactly to Ezekiel and say, oh man, this is what we're talking about. And also, given that reference, Ezekiel would have been quote unquote contemporary to Daniel, and so in some way you could make that argument, right? That's what we're referring to. But I do think that those overall themes are fairly pervasive throughout the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And so when it says this, it's like, okay, that tracks with the rest of what's spoken of in the Old Testament, talking about these things that clearly were written and people knew about these writings. And for all we know, they could have been, ancient Assyrian writings that people were referencing here, referring to a couple of different things. I mean, you never know. And so unless we have it in front of us and we know the quote, then we're probably not going to know for sure. But it definitely fits with several of the themes of the Old Testament.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. These are a lot of motif referencing here happening.
Yep. Well, let's keep going. I want to hear what happens to the creepy old guys.
All right. Okay, here we go. When the female servants went out, the two elders stood up and ran at her. They said, "Look, the gates are locked and nobody can see us.
Oh no.
We desire you, so do what we want and have sex with us. If you don't, we'll swear that you were meeting with a young man and that's why you sent your female servants away." Susanna groaned, "I'm trapped. If I do this, it's death, but if I don't, I still won't escape your plotting. But I'd rather not do this and fall into your hands than sin in the Lord's sight." So Susanna screamed, and at the same time the two elders called out. One of them ran and opened the gates to the garden. When the people in the house heard the shouting in the garden, they ran out through the side doors to see what had happened to Susanna. When the two elders had their say, the servants were very ashamed because nothing like this had ever been said about Susanna. The next day, when the people came to her husband Joachim, and the two elders came too, full of their immoral scheme to have Susanna killed, they said in front of the people, "Call Susanna, Hilkiah's daughter, who is married to Joachim." So they called her in. She came with her parents, her children, and all her relatives. Now, Susanna was elegant, beautiful in appearance. The criminals ordered the veil that she was wearing to be removed so they could soak in her beauty. But her household and all who saw her were crying. Upon taking the stand in front of everybody, the elders laid their hands on Susanna's head to give testimony. But she looked up to heaven while crying because she trusted the Lord. The elders said, "While we were walking around the large garden by ourselves, this woman came in with two female servants. She locked the gates of the garden and sent away the female servants. Then a young man who had been hiding came and lay with her. We were in the corner of the garden, and when we saw this lawless act, we went running to them. We saw them having sex, but we couldn't hold on to the man because he was stronger than we were. He opened the gates and ran away. So we grabbed this woman and asked who the young man was, but she wouldn't tell us. To this we swear." The assembly believed them because they were the people's elders and judges. So they sentenced Susanna to death. Susanna screamed out, "Eternal God, you know what is hidden. You see everything before it happens. You know they've lied in this court about me. Look, I'm going to die, although I didn't do any of the things that these men accuse me of in their malice."
Is it okay if we stop here? I just want to make sure we keep a manageable chunk, and I think I'm reading ahead and I see someone important is about to enter the scene.
All right.
Okay, so I just want to discuss everything that just happened. So first off, from someone who didn't grow up with this my entire life, being a Protestant, this is
Dark.
it's dark and it's gripping. It's like watching a drama on TV, which is just saying this is not dry or boring reading.
Not in any way, shape, or form. No,
not at all. Right. So, what thoughts come to mind for y'all? Anything just interesting from the passage?
It's interesting because we hear a lot of in the Old Testament evil people scheme and they get away with it, and it seems like those who are perverse are able to continue on. We read that because it's the whole why do good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and we see that throughout the Bible. And in reading this specifically, it's like this is like a clear-cut example, I guess, of that happening, right? Where we see someone has schemed, and this is a person who's supposed to be a leader of the people, a moral leader, a spiritual leader. Both of these men meant to be leaders, and so they are trusted. And better yet, they add to the story by being like, and there were two witnesses, and of course, two witnesses means it's true. Because, and I guess that now that I'm thinking about it, makes a lot more sense as to why the two of them were like, oh, well, now that there's two of us,
that's a good point.
That's a really good point.
Witnesses to what happened, right? So it's like now it makes sense because it's like now they are perverse together, and that gives them some amount of leverage, right? They understand the law and they're using it to their own benefit. Just really scummy. But it makes a good point that there were people who were doing bad things, and while I don't know that this story is canonically true, I can fairly well tell you that it's very likely something like this happened in the time frame that is discussed because people were evil in the sight.
Yeah, and not just once, but over and over and over again. It happens in America. It happens in Europe. It happens everywhere.
Well, I was going to add, this is still fairly rampant in the United States, and we have more protections, I would argue, than the ancient Jewish people did. Although, in my opinion, not quite as many as we'd hope, but that's not the point for today.
Right. Well, I just think my point in saying all this is that there was one of the main themes in the time of the exile is that the people disobeyed the Lord and that corruption had just permeated. And if you look back at the history of Israel and Judah, you do see that this time period was there was a lot of corruption in this time period. You can look at the end of the Second Temple period, and obviously Jesus speaks out against the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. But as far as the level of corruption that was seen, it's not, I won't say it didn't happen, but it didn't seem nearly as pervasive, or at least as visible as it was in this time frame, or even acceptable in this time frame. One could argue that this is because they finally, in the Second Temple period, became their own nation. They weren't unified with the other nations as much. I won't say at all.
The synagogues also helped a lot with that.
Indeed. So, there's probably a lesson to be learned in all of that. But in this case, these are just two really creepy old men who seem to be getting away with something really stupid.
I'm going to do my favorite thing again and pull out another psalm. Psalm 26. Vindicate me, Lord, for I have walked in my integrity and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Examine me, Lord, and put me to the test. Refine my mind and my heart, for your goodness is before my eyes, and I have walked in your truth. I do not sit with deceitful people, nor will I go with pretenders. I hate the assembly of evildoers, and I will not sit with the wicked. I will wash my hands in innocence, and I will go around your altar, Lord, that I might proclaim with the voice of thanksgiving and declare all your wonders. Lord, I love the dwelling of your house and the place where your glory remains. Do not take my soul away along with sinners, nor my life with men of bloodshed, in whose hands is a wicked scheme, and whose right hand is full of bribes. But as for me, I will walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. My foot stands on level ground. In the congregations, I will bless the Lord. Feels like a pretty direct... I mean, again, it's themes. The themes are present all throughout the Bible, but I feel like this is a very direct psalm to be applied to the situation.
I feel like, Jace, you need to just do like a whole series on psalms, because you're just so good at just being like, there's a psalm for that. And
there's a psalm for everything.
There's a psalm for everything. Jace knows what it is. It's quite the talent you have there.
Yeah, I just searched the word scheme. I knew there was one in there somewhere.
Well,
I couldn't remember where it was.
You've got a whole litany of options.
Yep.
It's very true.
Anyway, okay, so she screams to God, and what happened next?
All right. And the Lord heard her cry. As she was being led away to die, God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young man named Daniel. Okay, young man named Daniel. So, beginning...
This really probably is beginning of Daniel's time in Babylon.
But it has to be after he got there, so after like the first chapter or two.
Not even after the first chapter, though. I mean, he probably just rolled up and started asking for vegetables.
He's sitting there munching on a celery stick, and he's like, wait a minute, I object! I throw the carrot down at your feet! You're seeking the fat portions, but clearly she's vegetarian. I think that's the wisdom right there. Okay. Oh man, there we go. God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young man named Daniel. He shouted out loud, I am innocent of this woman's blood. All the people turned to him and asked, what are you saying? He stood among them and said, are you so stupid, Israelites, that you've sentenced an Israel... I have to imagine he said it that way, right?
I love this already.
While munching on his carrot.
Also,
While munching on his carrot.
I just want to add, to anyone who sees this as inspired, I want to make it clear, my laughing at it is my appreciating what I believe is some intended... I mean, the ridicule is supposed to be a little bit funny. That's how ridicule works. So... no disrespect. I'm just saying the text is doing a good job of what it's trying to do.
Jesus says plenty of funny things, too.
I would also like to point out, part of this is the translation we're reading.
That's true.
But the translation did an excellent job of making it kind of funny.
And now that I have an aspect of him munching on a carrot stick stuck in my head, I'm seeing Daniel as being played by Bugs Bunny. So
Daniel was not Bugs
Bunny. I can't unsee
could you imagine?
Yeah.
Oh my word!
I can't unsee that now. That's incredible.
This can't be a VeggieTales thing though, because Daniel would eat the veggies.
Cannibalism.
Are you so stupid, Israelites, that you've sentenced an Israelite woman to death without cross-examining her or finding the facts? Go back to court. These men have given false testimony against her. Everyone rushed back.
This book already.
I know you would. The other elders said to Daniel, sit here with us and advise us, since God has given you the status of an elder. All right, right there. That's actually a pretty challenging statement. He's a young guy and he's challenging the elders. That's huge in that culture, right?
That's right. Well,
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it would have been very unusual for this young gun over here to stand up and say, you guys are just messed up. Now,
yeah, and go ahead.
That being said, though, like, if you look at who is it that God calls as a prophet repeatedly, he calls young guys as prophets for that exact reason, that they're
Except
not
Moses.
Well, okay, yes, but you're talking about like Jeremiah. He was young. Ezekiel, relatively young. Yep. You know, you take a look around, and you start to realize, okay, God likes to use these young guys, and that's even in the canonical story of Daniel. That's one aspect of Daniel. He starts off as a young man, and he stands up against, you know, what the king is saying and what the order of the Babylonians was, just on the basis that, well, that's not the way we do that as people of God, right? And so I think it's very important that, like, yes, would he come up to somebody and say, are you stupid? Just, I don't know about that. But I do think that there's some element where it's just like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. Like, that's not a thing God would allow. So also, I appreciate it.
I'm pulling this just out of nowhere, but I am guessing that in some more tame translation, this would be something to the effect of, you fools, Israelites, blah, 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 blah. So,
yeah. Another thing I'm going to point out is, regardless of what the synagogue situation was this early in the like Babylonian exile. We know that this was written in Second Temple Judaism, so the synagogues were a big thing. One of the things in the synagogues was the seats of the elders. So if you're not familiar, the way that the synagogues were set up is you would have this big platform in the middle where the like parashat readings, so the Torah, the Ketuvim, all those things were read from, and everyone would sit or stand on the ground around there. But there were actual seats, and those seats were designated for the elders of the society. So the older people, once you reached a certain age, you'd be invited to join in the seats of the elders, and so you had to like be old enough to even be invited to sit there. And that was considered a sign of honor. So I think that that's part of what's being referenced here with sit here with us and advise us, since God has given you the status of an elder. It's very much saying like, this is a young guy and he's taking up a position that should be beyond his social status right now. But because God has empowered him to do it, he's able to reach this point. And they're saying it sarcastically, but that doesn't mean that it's any less true.
Very good. Let's carry on.
All right. Daniel told them, separate them from each other, and I'll cross-examine them. When they had been separated from each other, he called in one of the judges and said to him, the sins you did earlier are catching up to you now at the end of your long, evil life. You judged unfairly, sentencing the innocent to death and letting the guilty go, even though the Lord says, you will not sentence innocent and good people to death. Now then, if you really saw this woman, tell me this. Under what tree did you see them having sex? He said, under a clove tree. Daniel said, right, you lied. It's on your own head. Already God's angel has orders to cleave you down the middle. Then setting that one aside, he ordered them to bring in the other judge, and he said to him, you're a Canaanite, not from Judah. Beauty seduced you and sexual desire twisted your mind. You treated women from Israel this way, and they had sex with you because they were afraid of you. But this woman from Judah wouldn't tolerate your lawless immorality. So now tell me, under what tree did you catch them having sex with each other? And he said, under a yew. Daniel said to him, right, you lied too. It's on your own head. God's angel waits with his sword to hew you down the middle to destroy both of you. I'm going to pause here before we finish. Do you guys think the hew you down the middle thing is a reference to Solomon's wisdom and the judge's seat?
I think
No.
Yeah, it
I
seems
think it was
possible.
that.
He's playing a similar role.
Yes, to an extent, and this is very common for these types of teachings to have subtle references like this. So maybe it is. I'm not going to say it's totally not, but I at the same time do understand that like what was referenced in the Wisdom of Solomon was more of
Wisdom of Solomon's a different book.
No, sorry.
Okay, sorry. That different Second Temple period.
Reference in the story of Solomon's wisdom.
Very different. Yes.
Was actually I won't say it was a common practice, but it was to some extent like when he said, "Let's cut the baby in half," they thought that's a thing that happens. We should probably avoid that, right? Because if you hear somebody say like, "Oh, we're going to do that," it's like, "Oh, I've heard of people doing that. That's terrible," because it was something that did occasionally happen. But also, it was a common punishment back then.
Okay, so you think that this is more referencing a known capital punishment, a particularly brutal but known capital punishment.
Supposedly, that's what happened to Isaiah, actually.
I have heard that, actually.
Yeah. So, speculation again. Maybe it is referencing directly to Solomon.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be a direct reference, and I think, like you've pointed out, because of how common motifs are and how they're used, I think the same image can have multiple references, but I agree with Brad. There's definitely a element of, oh, look, here's this guy that's acting as a judge in a confusing case and is coming up with a very wise answer. I wonder who else has done that in the past, you know?
Right. I want to also add, so if you look at verse 53, I actually found this quote. He says, "You judged unfairly, sentencing the innocent to death and letting the guilty go, even though the Lord says, you will not sentence innocent and good people to death." That is a fairly direct quote. I mean, I would imagine it's perfect quote the way they translated it, just changing languages here. But it seems to be coming back to Exodus 23:7, which says, "Keep far away from a false charge or action, and do not condemn to death the innocent or the righteous, for I will not justify and acquit the guilty." So he is quoting from the law.
Yeah, he's like, you're straight up breaking Torah right now, dude. Yep. Then the whole assembly started shouting out praises to God who saves those who hope in him. They rose up against the two elders because Daniel had shown from their own words that they were false witnesses. They treated them in the same way that they had plotted to treat their neighbor. By following the law from Moses, they killed him. Hey, there's your reference. Innocent blood was saved that day. Hilkiah and his wife gave thanks that their daughter Susanna had not been found guilty of a shameful crime. Her husband Joachim and all their relatives also gave thanks. From that day, Daniel was honored among the people. That last line especially makes me definitely think this is supposed to be early in the life of Daniel, because he was certainly honored among the people pretty early on in his life.
Well, if this is still happening in Israel, is that what is referencing here? Or are we talking about or is this just happening in the realm of Israelites who were living in Babylon?
That's my understanding. Especially because you saw the theme in Prayer of Azariah and throughout Daniel that even though we're in exile, God is where his people are. So I feel like that's fair. Still just a common thing here.
Well, okay. So my thought on that is that generally speaking, people were separated when they got to Babylon. So is it possible that there was a village of Israelites living in Babylon, and like all the Israelites were just like in one little area? It's possible, very possible. But given what they did specifically to the young men at the beginning of Daniel, which is taking them to the palace and basically forcing them to forget their culture, putting them in a village full of people that have the same culture as them, unlikely. That being said, it's entirely possible that this is meant to set the stage for, hey, Daniel was a pretty wise guy, and then when they got taken captive, he was still a wise guy. So I mean, you could.
And also, I don't think any of us are against it not necessarily being a true historical event. You know,
that's fair. It could just be a really good story.
I wanted to add, so Daniel basically, I mean, he accuses them and says, you're supposed to cross-examine people. You didn't do that. You violated the law by failing to cross-examine, which that seemed odd to me because nothing jumped to mind in the Torah as saying, thou shalt cross-examine people whenever you have those two witnesses.
It doesn't say they violated the law, though. It just asks them if they're stupid.
Well, no, later when he's talking to them specifically, where is it? Here it is. He's sitting on his.
Go ahead.
Oh well, maybe I am misremembering. I thought it was in there, but perhaps I'm just totally imagining it. In any case, there was a standard for cross-examination apparently among the ancient Jews. So in Sanhedrin 40a, the Laws of Testimony 1:4, it says essentially. So I'm
surprised that you know this.
Because he looked it up.
Yes.
In Sanhedrin 40a, it says
I did have to look it up.
Subsection B, you must follow the following clause.
Essentially, there is a directive in the Old Testament that says, and you shall inquire and research thoroughly. And they took that to mean you had to cross-examine, and the Sanhedrin put together a 7-question structure that they would use in this cross-examination. And
of course it was 7 questions.
Of course it was. They would use these 7 questions, and you might notice the last one is a little familiar to this story. It says, in what 7-year cycle did the event occur? In what year? In what month? On what day of the month? On what day of the week? At what time? In what place? And so I think what's going on in this story is it's possible that they're actually using this same structure, and it's just recording the last of the 7 questions. In what place? And that's how we get to the tree question.
In what place? Oh, and by what tree? I see.
I also wonder if maybe this story was possibly given around the same time that led to that Sanhedrin structure being generated, because Sanhedrin, that is post-exile. So is this story being used as a rabbinical teaching example of why that's necessary to bolster that argument for putting that in place within the Sanhedrin?
Right. I mean, I would also, my guess, and I have not researched this, so please excuse me if I'm just totally wrong here, but my guess is that given that this is deuterocanonical, most of that stuff wasn't written in the time that the story takes place. This probably absolutely wasn't written during the Babylonian exile. It was probably written much later, maybe 200 BC, 300 BC.
Which could be when the Sanhedrin thing that you just read was from.
Exactly. That's my point.
Yeah. I think that those probably come around the same time. I have an interesting application of this story to New Testament things, but I want to finish up other discussions first, unless y'all are good to move that way.
Just before we move on, real quickly, I do think that it's interesting that you pointed out this whole thing about the 7-question structure of cross-examination that's there. We could make the argument that the orthodoxy of that 7-question structure came about by common practices of cross-examination. And so instead of it being like, oh, they did this, and so that's the way they did it, that's the way it's seen here, is that that's the way it was done, just by habits. And it could be that they've taken that from some Proto-Persian.
Yeah, it's almost certainly within
period.
the common cultural river.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, and so basically the idea here is that it's possible that, yes, this comes from the Sanhedrin doctrine, and it's possible that is the case. Even possible that this writing comes about much later, even than maybe what has been proposed. But on top of that, I do think it's important, though, that we look at the fact that this is Daniel. Basically, he's just as like, I'm a lawyer now. But he does such an excellent job because they even recognize, they're like, oh, now since you've got so much wisdom, why don't you advise us? And he's like, fine, then I will. And he advises based on the law, specifically what has happened. And so he, by these two witnesses, they prove each other to be false. And their plot to utilize this 2-witness scheme is now their undoing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to echo that, if this story was written in order to give a narrative for using the structure, even though it already existed in other cultures and they were just kind of adopting it, it wouldn't be the first time, because the intertestamental period, Second Temple writings, also that's where a lot of the stories about Melchizedek come from. Whenever you have the Hasmoneans trying to say that it's okay for them to be priests and kings at the same time, they try and reference back to Melchizedek, which we then see usurped and done a better job of in the book of Hebrews. So it wouldn't be the first time that you use a narrative to be able to do this. This is not my idea. This is something I listened to and heard, so I wanted to take y'all's thoughts on it, of an application of this story into the New Testament.
I'm listening.
All right.
Sure.
This is going to be a pretty familiar story here, okay? Early in the morning, he came again into the temple area. This is in John chapter 8, by the way. And all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began teaching them. Now the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in the act of adultery, and after placing her in the center of the courtyard, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. What then do you say?" Now they were saying this to test him, so they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger wrote on the ground. And when they persisted asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him to be the first to throw a stone at her." And then again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now when they heard this, they began leaving one by one, beginning with the older ones. And when he was left alone, and the woman where she was in the center of the courtyard, straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "I do not condemn you either. Go, from now on, do not sin any longer." All right. I feel like the application here is pretty straightforward. Something that I was interested to learn. I had always grown up hearing that the reason that the trap itself, actually, I want to hear, what had y'all grown up hearing that the trap was, or the test was, that the Pharisees set here?
Well, it was never really explained to me, but I just kind of inferred myself. But the inference being that if he didn't accuse the woman and say, "You should stone her," then obviously that was breaking the law, because the law says to stone her. If he did accuse her, then most of what first of all, you could turn around and it's the trap of, well, where's the evidence? That's one particular trap. Although they say, "We've caught this woman," so if more than two witnesses say they caught her, they caught her, right? So the other theory then would be if he doesn't agree to stone her, then he is, or if he does agree to stone her, the people would turn against him and be like, well, you have, basically given up on this whole teaching of reconciliation and things like that.
Yep. Brad had.
I would echo that. I wasn't ever taught it specifically, but my interpretation was always essentially it'd be violating Torah to not stone her, but it would be contrary to his teachings and unpopular to stone her.
What I had been told is that it would be violating Torah to not stone her, but I had been told that the Romans were the only ones with the authority to execute, and therefore it would be violating Roman law to stone her, and so then they could get him in trouble with Roman authorities.
That is correct to my knowledge.
That's
so
actually
a really good
false.
Point.
It is.
Well, never mind.
The Romans were the only ones with authority to crucify people, but stoning was considered more of a common execution that other people could do. Additionally, there was Roman law that said that it was lawful for men to have sex outside of marriage, both with other men and with women, whereas it was not lawful for women to have sex outside of marriage, which would explain why just the woman was there. So it would have been totally lawful, according for Roman law, for if she was caught in the act of adultery, for them to stone her. So an interesting thought then is this the real trap? One, if he says, first off, you have to take into account where they are. They're in the temple right here, okay? They're on temple grounds in the courtyard. So one, if he says stone her, or if he says don't stone her, then he's breaking Torah. Two, if he says stone her, then he's not showing himself to be a wise judge like Daniel was in this intertestamental period work that would have been known by the people there. Okay? So he can't just say stone her because he wouldn't be following the cross-examination protocol established in Daniel and established by the Sanhedrin. But if he's going to cross-examine, now he's having everybody talk about very lewd sexual topics in the temple in the presence of God, which would be at the worst blasphemy, but at the very least, it would be very sacrilegious. So the trap seems to be, if you say no, you're breaking Torah. If you say yes, you're not wise. And if you go with cross-examination, you're degrading the temple where God is.
Yeah, I guess you could make that argument. I always feel like, I don't know. I feel like that's a very possible element to this trap. I think, though, that the trap itself is maybe a bit more obvious than all of that, but it's very possible that they just put him in a terrible social position and they did. But also, they took a woman caught in the act of adultery and brought her to
supposedly.
Where's
the evidence that she was caught in the act of adultery?
Like I said earlier, the two or more witnesses thing.
Okay, but that's what we see in Daniel.
Yes, you're absolutely correct, and it technically does follow the law, but no one's cross-examined. So, I mean, you could say cross-examination here, and that could be one way that you handle that.
I agree that the implication of this story here in John is that she was actually caught in the act of adultery when she's like, oh, no one's condemned me. And Jesus is like, well, go and sin no more. Like,
right.
There is the implication that this is a legitimate thing.
She sinned, but she did a thing she was not supposed to do.
Even in that situation, you're still stuck with the situation where these two scribes just creeping around, spying on women that might be committing adultery somewhere. There is still the creepy old man aspect to the story.
Yes, there is. Definitely.
So anyways, whenever I first heard this, I really liked the application of the Susanna story into the story of the adulterous woman.
I can see that connection. I think just is there wisdom in Daniel shows wisdom in utilizing the law to save someone who's innocent, whereas the contrast is these elders used the law to profane God and everything he stands for. And so, yeah, I definitely think that there's certain elements to which it's like, yes, Jesus understood something higher than the law. And I think that's the idea of Daniel here as well, is that he understood the wisdom. His wisdom didn't come from the law. His wisdom came from God. and that's what set him apart from everybody else.
But I wouldn't even say necessarily higher than the law. Jesus understood the true intent of the law.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
what
is
I
a better
mean,
way to
is
say
that the intent of the law, which goes beyond just did you physically follow the law, but goes into are you living in accordance with the will of God? And that was the intention of it. Whereas that becomes forgotten in many of the contexts of, you see the Old Testament. It's like they were just like, well, I'm following the law, and I'm going and I'm offering sacrifices, and God's like, I don't care about your sacrifices because you continue to.
I desire mercy, not
Yes,
sacrifice.
exactly. So, I mean, you can still see those elements there as well. That Daniel's pointing out in this case, he's showing wisdom by pointing out the fault, and that is that they did not follow the law because they are only using the law to benefit themselves and not using it to truly follow God. And if they had been using it to follow God, then this wouldn't be a problem, right? If they had been using it to follow God, they wouldn't have been caught. And so his point to them is, hey, you did this to yourself. And like they're thinking they've got it. They think they've got it made. They're in the clear. And Daniel looks at them and says, you have put yourself in a terrible position because you have done this. And I think it almost, now that you mentioned the parallel to John 8, there is almost a certain element of that as well. Like, okay, fine. You want to condemn her? If you haven't been condemned, then you can condemn her. And then it makes them not reflect necessarily on, well, what is the technicality of the law here, but it reflect instead on what are the implications of what it is you're trying to do. What are the implications here on a grander scheme of the point you're trying to make? Because when they go to him, they don't care about what happens to this woman. They care about trying to trap Jesus. And his point is, okay, fine. You want to condemn this woman just like you want to condemn me. Let's talk about condemnation for a second. How many of you have not been condemned by the law? And of course, they all have. And that leaves the point. And so, anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think I see the parallel you're trying to make here.
Yeah. And again, I'll bring us back to Psalm 82. How long will you judge unjustly and so show partiality to the wicked? Vindicate the weak and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and destitute, rescue the weak and needy, save them from the hand of the wicked. Pretty direct. That sums it up really nicely.
Absolutely. One thing I noticed that I thought was interesting, this isn't a major point, I just found it surprising, was that if you look at the characters in this story that are identified by name, you have Susanna, Susanna's father Hilkiah, and her husband Joachim. And you don't have the elders' names, which I don't know. I just thought that was a little bit surprising given the central role they play in the narrative. I suppose I don't actually have a takeaway from that. I just thought it was that there might be a takeaway that I'm missing, that for some reason they didn't include names for the
I would
for
like
the two
to
elders.
know two and again, these are tangential things. One, are the names Joachim, Susanna, and Hilkiah, are those Babylonian names or those Hebrew names? My guess is they'd be Hebrew names. They are? Okay.
They're Hebrew names.
Okay. Also, do they have specific meanings associated with them? I don't know.
They do, but they're
If
not
they are
overly
Hebrew, they have a meaning
related to the
associated
text.
with them. Yeah.
They do, but they're not
Right.
central to this text. So like Hilkiah's name means my portion is Yahweh, and Susanna means lily or lotus flower, which that one actually works.
And she's bathing
pretty.
in a garden, so a plant, water.
Yeah.
That's true. And then Joachim means lifted by Jehovah. So
I think they're all very
Yahweh,
common
but,
names,
we
though.
like to transliterate things poorly.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Hilkiah also pulled up, I forget who it was exactly, there it is, a Hebrew priest in the time of King Josiah. So I don't think that's an intentional connection, if I were guessing. I think it's just a common name.
Probably.
But, yeah, just thought that was interesting.
All right. Any other comments on it, or are we wrapping it up?
I think that covers it for me. If we're... not that it's necessarily the best standard to just compare two texts, but if we are going to compare two texts, I thought the prayer of Azariah was I was more, I don't want to say more impressed by it because I'm not trying to be disrespectful to this text, but it felt more impactful to me. This was an interesting story and a fun story, and that definitely has its own place. And I love the way it sets up Daniel as a character. But looking forward to the next one because Prayer of Azariah was very, very impactful and just neat the way it tied in so much
Well,
Old
and I think it
Testament
comes
imagery.
down to Prayer of Azariah was poetic. And it was meant to be poetic, and this is meant to be a narrative. And narratives, I think the way we view narratives is a little bit different because this narrative was meant to tell a story, meant to give you basically a meaning of the story at the end of the day. Like, look at this, these two rascals, they were up to no good, and Daniel was like, hey guys, you shouldn't do that because God's gonna get you. And God got him at the end of the day. And so while it is easy to just be like, well, it's not as, Prayer of Azariah was meant to be appreciated. And this story is meant to be beholden as a story of, first of all, God's ability to grant wisdom to Daniel, but secondly, God's desire to preserve the righteous. So those are both good qualities to take away from the story.
Yeah, I like Prayer of Azariah simply because it does seem to be a massive reflection on Genesis, which I always enjoy. This one, there's a good chance that there's a lot of references to the Old Testament that we're not catching, but there's also a really good chance that this has a lot of references, and I think we kind of picked out some of them potentially, to intertestamental period writings that we just aren't familiar with, and that would have meant a lot more to the culture that this was originally written in. So there may just be a lot of context that we're missing on this one, that's stopping us from being able to appreciate it to the same level as we were Prayer of Azariah, which I'm sure we missed a lot on that one too. So
That's an excellent point, and this is a good reminder to anyone listening that if you're looking for a great study of these texts, we strongly recommend that you listen to us for entertainment and then go somewhere
this
else
is
for the
not
great
it.
study, because we are looking at these for the first time and just trying to give a second perspective, from sort of the Protestant side that doesn't always tune into these intertestamental texts.
Excellent point, Brad. And I think too, it's important to keep in mind. Yes, we have a fresh perspective on this, but there are people who have a more in-depth perspective on this, and we can definitely after this. I'm going to go be doing some research because I'm curious to see what others have discovered or have, I guess, determined about this passage and what the translations may have been about this passage so that I could get a better perspective and appreciation for this. But that is something that we will probably all be doing. We're constantly looking for a better perspective, I guess. And so that's important as well.
All right, I think that's going to wrap up this episode of Protestants React. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll join us for the next one. And what's the story we're going to be doing on the next one? I don't even remember the name of it. That
Is
sounds
it
right.
Bell and the Dragon?
All right, so join us next
Well,
time
there we
for
go.
Belle and the Dragon. Not Belle and the Beast, very different. Beauty and the Beast is not in the Bible. Arguably, neither is Belle and the Dragon. We'll get there. All right, thanks.
Okay.